Assalamu alaikum. This is Hena Zuberi, and you're watching Muslim Network News. Despite a ceasefire that began this morning, Israeli police once again attacked Palestinians, this time in Masjid Al-Aqsa in occupied Jerusalem. Israeli police officers entered the mosque compound today and fired tear gas and sound grenades. There were no reports of ceasefire violations in occupied Palestine. Palestinians living in the flashpoint neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah say they have been placed under a siege by Israeli authorities. This is the neighborhood where Israeli settlers tried to forcefully remove Palestinians from their homes during the end of Ramadan. In the meantime, the United States has announced it will be at the forefront of an international effort to help rebuild Gaza. Israel's bombing campaign has resulted in more than $250 million in damage to the Palestinian territory. This includes attack on electricity and water infrastructure, affecting access to drinking water for about 800,000 Palestinians. Schools and clinics, hospitals are amongst the institutions that must be rebuilt. Despite Israel's latest attacks, the U.S. has already made a 10-year commitment to provide nearly $40 billion in military aid to the country. The city of Lod remains under a state of emergency as hundreds of Israeli border police patrol the area. The city is just 5 miles from the Tel Aviv International Airport. It was a site of clashes between Palestinians and Israeli settlers. This resulted in the displacement of several Jewish and Palestinian families from the area. Lod was originally a Palestinian city which was occupied in 1948 by the Israeli army. It is now 80% Jewish. In our show tonight, we're going to discuss this aspect of the occupation. In a landmark move, Senator Bernie Sanders has introduced a resolution to block a $735 million arms sale to Israel. Sanders introduced the legislation on Thursday to stop the sale of joint direct attack munitions and small diameter bombs. Support for Israel remains strong amongst U.S. legislators. However, a group of progressive politicians in the Democratic Party have begun to question their country's unwavering support. They've called into question America's annual $3.8 billion unconditional foreign aid to Israel. Sanders' resolution would need a simple majority to pass in both chambers of Congress. We're going to discuss this development in detail later tonight, so keep watching Muslim Network TV. The United Arab Emirates has signed a memorandum of understanding to buy a stake in Israel's Tamar offshore gas field. When completed, it will be the biggest business deal between the UAE and Israel. The negotiation is expected to be widely criticized due to Israel's ongoing attacks on Gaza. The deal will allow Israel to increase its national oil reserves. Israel also hopes it will help it expand outside interest in its gas and oil reserves. The UAE and Israel normalized their ties in August 2020. Over 600 faculty, staff, and students at Georgetown University have signed a statement of solidarity with Palestinian people. They agree with the reports of Human Rights Watch and the Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem, which accuses Israel of apartheid. The statement also notes that Israel's oppression has been dismissed and marginalized in American academic institutions. This is despite Palestinian proof of the atrocities. Signatories agreed to work to rectify this. Prominent Georgetown scholar of Islam, Dr. John Esposito, is amongst those who signed the statement. Georgetown is based in Washington, D.C., and is considered one of the top-ranked universities in the United States. 35 Republican representatives have joined Democratic colleagues to pass a bill to investigate the January 6th attack on Capitol Hill. However, minority leaders are opposing the bipartisan bill. Now legislation appears unlikely to pass the Senate. Republican leader Mitch McConnell blasted the House bill as slanted and unbalanced. His comments came a day after former U.S. President Donald Trump urged Republicans to not approve the Democrat trap. Trump is seen as instigating the violence and would be at the center of any investigation of events that day. 22 Republican-led states have announced plans to cut extended benefits for the unemployed. The cancellations will affect over 3 million workers currently relying on unemployment benefits. The American Rescue Plan signed by President Joe Biden earlier this year authorized federal pandemic unemployment benefits until September 6th. However, these states are opting to end benefits early, beginning in June. Prosecutors are calling for new charges against 3 former Minneapolis police officers in the George Floyd murder case. Floyd was killed after former officer Derek Chauvin pinned him to the ground with a knee to his neck. Ex-officers Thomas Lane and James King helped to restrain Floyd. King knelt on Floyd's back and Lane held down Floyd's leg. Former officer To Tao Tao held back bystanders and kept them from intervening during the roughly 9.5-minute restraint. This all occurred as Floyd repeatedly said he couldn't breathe. Chauvin was convicted last month of second-degree unintentional murder, third-degree murder, and manslaughter. He's currently awaiting sentencing. All 4 former officers also face federal charges accusing them of violating Floyd's civil rights. The ubiquitous Amazon Ring video doorbell has become the largest surveillance network in the United States. Ring has connected 1 in 10 police departments across the U.S. to access recorded content from millions of Ring security cameras. An estimated 400,000 Ring devices were sold in December 2019. Amazon does not release the actual number of Ring doorbells that have been sold, but that number could be in hundreds of millions. Amazon has brokered more than 1,800 partnerships with local law enforcement agencies that can access the owner's video content without a warrant. This prompted Max Eliezer, an Amazon employee, to write to his management that said the Ring doorbell is simply not compatible with a free society. U.S. President Joe Biden has waived sanctions on a company building a controversial gas pipeline between Russia and Germany. The pipeline would take gas from the Russian Arctic under the Baltic Sea to Germany. It is already more than 95% complete. The U.S. also lifted sanctions on an ally of Russian President Vladimir Putin, Mateusz Warnig. He leads the Nord Stream 2 project, which is leading the construction of the pipeline. As a pandemic is raging in India and the government is failing its citizens, volunteers are picking up the slack. More details in this report by Ali Khalaf and Saleha Farouk.
While minorities in India face Hindutva fascism, they are still teaming together to volunteer. Sayyid Ibrahim volunteers with a Muslim charity group to carry out funerals and cremations every day. Sayyid is a member of Mercy Angels, a group of Muslim, Christian, and Hindu volunteers in Bangalore. This group helps poor families transport bodies to cemeteries and crematoriums. Sayyid says, in our religion, it's said that God has destined certain things for us, so we bravely take care of the burials and anything else people need from us. The group prepares graves and offers final prayers according to different religious customs. Suneet Sharma, on the other hand, volunteers in New Delhi with a Sikh association. Suneet every day stages dozens of funerals. However, he cried when a father arrived at the crematorium with the body of his infant daughter. Suneet sleeps in his car at night and has not seen his family for 2 months in order to keep the virus away from them. In the meantime, India today reported 4,529 deaths in the past 24 hours. However, Washington Post writer Rana Ayub believes that the actual death count is 10 times higher than this. That would make the death toll approximately 40,000 deaths per day.
Islamophobia in France is very gendered. Muslim women's dress is considered a threat. More details in this report by Ali Khalaf and Saleha Farouk.
France continues to fight Muslims. Through its colonization, the nation killed millions of Muslims, but was unable to make them French. This time, it has turned against Muslim women. The French Senate voted to ban Muslim girls 18 and under from wearing the hijab in public. Mothers who accompany their children will also be banned from wearing the hijab. This Islamophobic campaign is not sitting well with French Muslims. The hashtag "Hands off my hijab" has become a rallying cry. Muslim women around the world are also sharing photos and videos in support of French Muslims.
We need your help.
The proposal for the ban still needs to be approved by France's National Assembly before it can become a law. France was one of the first European countries to impose hijab restrictions on Muslims. In 2004, it prohibited the wearing of the Islamic headscarf in state schools. In 2010, it banned the use of the face veil for all women. In 2016, several French towns banned the burkini swimming suit for Muslim women. French discrimination against Muslim women has been steadily enforced in the name of national integrity for some time. Much of this is also rooted in the imperialistic legacy of France. French occupied many Muslim-majority lands in Africa and the Middle East. During this period, there was also a drive to ban the veil and Arabic language from the public sphere. The colonial mindset has continued in France and has been the root of the blatant Islamophobia in the state.
Coming up next after the break is our in-depth analysis segment. So stay tuned and we'll be right back after these messages.
If I could be you, and you could be me for just 1 hour. If we could find a way to get inside each other's minds. Walk a mile in my shoes. Walk a mile in my shoes. Well, before you abuse, criticize, and accuse. Walk a mile in my shoes.
Assalamu alaikum. This is Imam Abdul Malik Mujahid. Walking up and down the world's largest refugee camps, I met Sister Fatima. Well, I'm calling her a sister. She was just a teenage girl, my granddaughter's age. Her parents were slaughtered by the Burmese military, and she was dragged by the Burmese soldiers to their hut, and all night long she was violated. She lost consciousness. When she regained, and in the morning and soldiers were themselves away, she ran and hid in a vegetable patch. Some people saw her, gave her clothes, and took her 4-day-long walk to Bangladesh. Who will speak up for her? Who will stand up for her if not you and I? It's our responsibility. It's our duty, brothers and sisters in humanity. And that's why I like you to support Burma Task Force. I'm a volunteer for it. But Burma Task Force is standing up to stop this genocide, violation of our sisters. You and I are free, they are not. Please stand up, work with Burma Task Force, and donate today to Burma Task Force. Together, we can do it. Assalamu alaikum.
Despite the development of a COVID-19 vaccine, millions around the world will not have access. We need a vaccine that's free and available to everyone, everywhere. It's time for a people's vaccine.
Welcome back. Earlier in our show, we shared a story about the introduction of a legislation to block U.S. arms sales to Israel by Bernie Sanders. To discuss this in detail, let's go to Saliha Farouk. Over to you, Saliha.
As always, I do appreciate that, Hena. Today, we're very happy to be joined by Grant Smith, who is the director of the Institute for Research for Middle Eastern Policy based out of Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Grant.
Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure. Now, you might be aware yesterday, Bernie Sanders introduced a new resolution that seeks to block arms sales to Israel, which is worth around $700 million, or if not a little bit more. Now, given his position in government as a senator, as well as an independent from Vermont, if you can please talk to us a little bit about the potential effectiveness of his proposal, which we know will eventually be voted for in Congress.
Sure. I think the problem with putting too much hope into this is kind of the trajectory of Bernie Sanders. I mean, there's many people are aware of this video footage of him berating in town hall meetings his supporters who were trying to hold him to account for U.S. policy toward Israel, all the unconditional aid, etc. And there he was yelling and shouting at them and trying to kind of hold on to a, unconditional aid for Israel is above all type position. So that was several years ago. And he's come around now to actually listen to his constituents and represent them more in trying to stop things like this horrific resupply of JDAMs and other guided munitions, because that's what his constituents want. But I do have to say that Bernie Sanders had every right as a U.S. senator to notify the party that he's aligned with, which in this case would be the Democratic Party, that he was going to put a hold on the actual legislation to transfer U.S. arms to Israel. He had that power as a U.S. senator, and he could have effectively blocked the entire aid package. But instead, what he's proposing is a non-binding resolution that at best is a gentle slap on the wrist. And this is kind of a theme that we've seen over and over again, not only with Bernie, but also the squad, where when it comes right down to using the full authority and power they have as representatives of Americans, who, as our polls all show, are increasingly uncomfortable with the unconditional support that Israel gets from the legislature. He could have done something meaningful and, I would say, powerful, but instead he's engaged in a signaling operation with a non-binding resolution.
Now, this specific weapons sale was actually planned out prior to the recent violence between the Israeli government and Hamas. Given the ongoing bombardment, keeping in mind the recent ceasefire from this morning, of course, what do you think might be the trajectory of this sales plan and export plan of the weapons to Israel?
Well, as you know, there is a $3.8 billion commitment to provide unconditionally U.S. weapons to Israel that was signed during the Barack Obama administration, which has, so far delivered quantities of weapons, and there's never been even a hiccup in those deliveries. The aid is provided on an accelerated basis so that Israel can receive interest on the actual money that's allocated, something that no other country gets. So my perception as someone who's watched this for many, many, many years is that when things have calmed down, we'll see a resumption in the transfer of extremely advanced weapons from the United States, which is something Israel's lobby here in this country demands. And they'll also resume the very sorts of activities that triggered the military response from Hamas in the first place, which is the ongoing ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from East Jerusalem and from other areas that Israel wants to have for Jewish-only occupation. So, this sort of thing has happened before, and I see no real obstacle to it happening again under the Biden administration.
Thank you for that. Now, when we think about the ongoing warfare that you're describing here, I can't help but shift the focus over to various efforts to try to subside this ongoing violence. I just wanted to get your professional perspective on this. The United States, as a nation, has an extensive history, of course, of blocking various United Nations resolutions against Israeli war crimes over the past 5 decades or so. And once again, since the recent violence started, of course. So why do you think that is, and how does this kind of U.S. support coincide with Congress's tendency to support Israel with arms?
Well, as Ian Williams, who's a leading correspondent at the United Nations, recently repeated at a recent conference we held, the amount of effort that is applied directly by Israel and its vast global lobby within the UN, constantly demanding that their concerns be, heightened above all others, pressuring the General Secretary, constantly, seeking meetings and opportunities to block Palestinian efforts in the United Nations. That's been ongoing. The lobby is as much of a force in the UN with its various front groups as it is within the US Congress. So there's no reason to believe that with this extremely compliant new US UN ambassador in place and the party devotion to unconditional support for all things Israel at the UN, there's no reason to expect that any of the extremely justified accountability measures which have been demanded by other countries will get any sort of purchase at the United Nations. The Biden administration has been very forthright that it's not going to make any sort of huge flurry there like the Obama administration did by simply abstaining from a Security Council resolution against further Israeli settlements. The Biden administration is not going to do that at the beginning of its rule when it would have immediate repercussions on its hopes to get more seats in the 2022 elections and other things that it seeks to fund through Israel lobby donor networks. So you're not going to see any giant gestures at the UN.
Now, you're, of course, a director of a research institute that's based on topics around Middle Eastern policy. I wanted to ask if you could share for our viewers just any insights that you might have on how you believe U.S. Congress could, if it wanted to, curb weapons funding to Israel. What would it take for this to happen, perhaps?
Yeah, so as I said earlier, the so-called progressive leaders of the squad, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, and AOC, have all the tools they need in their current position as representatives to block U.S. aid to Israel. And that is because after key senators discovered back in the early 70s that Israel had been diverting weapons-grade uranium with the compliance of various Zionist Organization of America engineers and operatives at a plant in Pennsylvania, Senators Stuart Symington and John Glenn, the famous astronaut, who had visited the CIA, who had taken action on the NUMEC diversion, managed to pass 2 amendments to the Foreign Assistance Act, which are still on the books, applying to the current foreign aid legislation, which is very simple. They simply say the U.S. will not transfer foreign aid to countries that have put together a clandestine nuclear weapons program but have not signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So AOC, Rashida Tlaib, the rest of the squad, Bernie Sanders could raise the issue of U.S. foreign aid, not just the missiles and the guided munitions, but all U.S. foreign aid to Israel has been illegal since the mid-1970s. And they could ask the Biden administration for certification that no weapons are going to be transferred to a nuclear weapons state. But just like Bernie Sanders won't do more than issue a toothless resolution, the squad has, although they've been notified, so far refused to raise this binding legal issue when it comes to foreign aid packages for Israel. They simply won't do it.
Now, thank you so much for being here with us. I can't help but just take advantage of that and ask you one last question regarding the recent developments this morning, of course, which is the ceasefire that occurred between Israel and Palestine, brokered, of course, by Egypt. What does this mean going forward for these two parties and for the violence?
Well, I think it's important to understand that the Biden administration only pressured and said that they expected the Israelis to enter into a ceasefire because it was getting tremendous heat from the millions of Americans who are tired of all of this unconditional support based on discredited Zionist mythology about Israel being such a great ally and such a great humanitarian cause. Because it was causing so much discomfort with the protests and people appearing in front of the White House and marching in places like Richmond and other major cities, Joe Biden decided they didn't want to keep taking the heat for being wrong about supplying this unconditional aid. But unless that heat continues, unless the protest continues, unless the outrage over this horrific U.S.-Israel relationship doesn't subside, they're going to be hard-pressed to go back to business as normal. But nobody should view this as anything but a temporary halt, because the United States only does these sorts of things when it thinks it absolutely has to. Otherwise, it's a blank check.
Grant Smith, Director of Washington, D.C.-based Institute for Research of Middle Eastern Policy. Thank you so much for being here with us, Grant. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to everybody tuning in today. I wanted to hand it over to Hena in the newsroom.
Thank you for that discussion, Saliha and Grant. Before moving on to our next analysis, let's take a quick break. We'll be right back after these messages.
Our fellow Americans.
Right now, the COVID-19 vaccines are available to millions of Americans.
And soon, they will be available to everyone.
The science is clear. These vaccines will protect you and those you love from this dangerous and deadly disease.
They could save your life.
So we urge you to get vaccinated when it's available to you.
That's the first step to ending the pandemic and moving our country forward. It's up to you.
Friends, our world is pulling together like never before. We're making huge sacrifices to keep one another safe. Scientists are working non-stop to develop COVID-19 vaccines and treatments. A vaccine will get our economies moving. It will tell our loved ones we're safe again. But we have challenges we must address. Right now, huge pharmaceutical companies are keeping the vaccine research a secret. They're deciding how many vaccines get made, how much to charge for them, and who gets vaccinated. This will no doubt leave billions of people behind. Pharma companies are putting profit, not people, first. Yet, billions of dollars of taxpayers' money is funding their work. We cannot let the CEOs of a handful of pharmaceutical companies decide our future. We need a vaccine that everyone can have free of charge, no matter where you live or whether you're rich or you're poor. We need companies to share all their research so we can make enough safe vaccines for everyone. We need a vaccine owned by all of us. To end this COVID-19 pandemic, we need to pull together once more.
Dad, they took over my bedroom. Come on, come on. Okay, Dad. 1, 2, 3. Dad! You saved me. Dad?
Are you okay?
I'm fine, dear.
Your hero needs you now, and AARP is here to help. Find the care guides you need at aarp.org/caregiving.
Welcome back. To discuss the latest situation in Palestine and the impact of the ceasefire, let's go to Imam Abdul Malik Mujahid for details. Over to you, Imam Mujahid.
Thank you, Hena. Ceasefire, it is good that it is in place. But what did people accomplish with more than 250 dead, 70,000 or so homeless? Aqsa was invaded this morning again by Israeli police, and Gaza remains as an open-air prison. And Palestinians in Israel continue to live in ghettos. So what did Israel and Palestinians accomplish? To discuss that with us is Sami Hamdi, who is editor-in-chief of International Interest. Welcome to Muslim Network TV. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. Thank you for having me.
So what will happen next? Is Palestine going to be free now?
I think that the Palestinians during this latest bout between the Palestinians and the Israeli occupation, I think the Palestinians delivered two heavy defeats that will have lasting repercussions in terms of how the cause or how the issue actually unfolds. I think the first victory or the first defeat that the Palestinians delivered on the Israeli occupation was that for the first time they finally managed to break Israel's monopoly on the narrative. For the first time, we heard words such as apartheid and occupation, colonization being used on the floor in Congress. We saw it being used in the media, whether it was tonight with the John Oliver show or with Mark Ruffalo or these other high-profile figures that are beginning to demonstrate a shift in the debate in how we talk about the discourse. Whereas in the past, Israel was able to essentially maintain a monopoly over the narrative and the terminology that could be used to describe the Israeli occupation of the Palestinians. Now we are beginning to talk about the issue, even if it has taken 70 years, where the world is beginning to talk about the issue in terms that accurately reflects the reality. And this has deep repercussions in terms of how we go forward. Firstly, we're seeing that in the Congress, bills are now being presented in order to prevent the sale of weapons to Israel. We've seen Nicholas Kristof write yesterday in the New York Times that the unshakable relationship between the US and Israel is now shaking, and we're seeing now an increased Palestinian generation well equipped with social media, now able to bypass mainstream media in order to deliver the gruesome photos and videos to the world, to the public opinion, that was absolutely integral in pressuring Biden to move away from his claims that Israel has the right to self-defense, to calling Netanyahu personally and telling him in no uncertain terms that he had to bring about a ceasefire irrespective of the conditions. And that's why the ceasefire that we've seen take place is an unconditional ceasefire on the part of Israel. And this cannot be overstated, because what it means is that now when we're moving forward in how we discuss it, we're seeing even in Israelis, in the Israeli occupation, in the society itself, amongst the Israelis, we're seeing the debate now begin to shift. We're seeing the Haaretz newspaper now publishing an article in which it says, yes, we as Israel have crossed the line. We have become an apartheid state. We're seeing an increasing number of Israelis begin to talk about a one-state solution and beginning to ask the questions why the Tel Aviv does not give equal rights to the Palestinians. And it's important to stress why this particular one-state solution is so important, and it is because when we talk about...
Before you go there, Sami, are you, I mean, you sound pretty upbeat, and President Biden has claimed the credit. Do you really give him credit to stopping all of this?
I don't give him any credit. What I mean is that Biden was forced to move as a result of the public pressure that came about as a result of the persistence of the Palestinians in Gaza, in the West Bank, and even the 1947 territories, who forced a reality on Biden. Because of the social media activity that they engaged in, they managed to mobilize large sections of the world's population, even people who had never been interested in the issue before. It managed to drive people to the streets in large protests. It managed to cause a schism in the Democrat Party. It managed to bring about an argument about this issue in Congress, and Biden, in order to rescue his party and rescue his image that had come under significant pressure as a result of the Palestinian efforts with regards to putting out their narrative and telling the world about their cause, Biden was forced to move, and Biden was forced to end this war earlier than Netanyahu would have liked. The other point on this that's important to stress is that in this round of the conflict, we saw people in the 1948 borders take to the streets. The Palestinians of the 1948 borders take to the streets, implying that this resistance that the Palestinians are embarking on is not limited to Gaza or the West Bank, but rather it's the conscience is still alive and the conscience is still wider. If we're talking about it in tangible terms, as you alluded to earlier in your question, what did anybody really gain from the deaths that took place from the people who died? It is hard to measure intangible gains, primarily because no territory was taken. Israel is going to continue storming the Al-Aqsa Mosque. It's likely they will continue with their evictions of Sheikh Jarrah. So if we're measuring it from this perspective, then it's perfectly true that nothing has been gained. But I think that undermines the value of the narrative and also the value of the trajectory in terms of where we were and where we are now. Once upon a time, you could not call Israel an apartheid regime in Congress. Now you can. Once upon a time, you could not declare Israeli occupation on Palestine without being called either anti-Semite or a lunatic. Now you can. Now John Oliver is doing it and the other media personalities are doing it. And Israel is so worried about that and so frustrated with that, that Benny Gantz, the Israeli defense minister, ordered a meeting with Facebook and TikTok executives on the 15th of May, in which he demanded of them that they take down pro-Palestine content. If those pro-Palestine content was nothing to be bothered about, why meet with the executives? Why make these demands? Why task as Israel Arabic account on Twitter to essentially try to frame the war in a manner in which it's a war against Iran and not against Palestine? Because there's an appreciation that in terms of the public narrative war, they are losing. And if Israel is so concerned about that, that demonstrates that they believe it's an integral part of trying to maintain the occupation. Because now if you talk about Israel in terms of the reality, in terms of it being an occupation, then Biden, as he demonstrated in this war, finds it increasingly uncomfortable and difficult for him to continue providing the immunity. MPs in the UK Parliament are applying pressure on the Prime Minister. Suddenly, when this outrage, go ahead.
At this moment, the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood around Masjid Al-Aqsa, the last majority enclave of Palestinians, it is cordoned off by Israeli military. People from outside cannot enter. That's where the whole thing began. A protest to stop the ongoing apartheid and taking Palestinian out. So they are still there. Do you think, I mean, I don't know if the bills which are presented to stop aid to Israel will ever pass. But it is, presenting a bill is possible, but getting it passed is a very different thing, especially now that ceasefire has been achieved. Do you think there is a hope for the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah?
I personally, if you were to ask me in a private situation, but we'll make it in a public situation, if you were to ask me in private, I would tell you there's very little hope for Sheikh Jarrah, and that Israel is intent on evicting them, and primarily because the Israelis have realized that while they can pressure Palestinians and make their lives hell in other areas and therefore force the Palestinians to up and leave to more secure areas, they are struggling to do that in Al-Aqsa. They are struggling to drive the Palestinians out of Al-Aqsa. And this is why I think that when it comes to the tangible means in terms of preventing the evictions of Sheikh Jarrah, I think that is far more complicated. However, it doesn't mean that it will necessarily happen. What the Palestinians managed to achieve in this latest round of conflict is to begin to consider opportunities or begin to secure opportunities that were not available before. Remember the situation before this conflict took place. Palestinian elections fell through. Mahmoud Abbas decided not to go through with it because he felt he would lose those elections. There was a general deflated atmosphere as a result of the normalization of ties between some Arab states, the UAE, Sudan, Bahrain, and Morocco, with Israel. There was this sense that Israel was winning. But now when we see that Israel, after the ceasefire, goes after the Al-Aqsa worshippers, that does not come from a position of a country that has won, but rather a country that is so frustrated, or an occupier that is so frustrated with the world saying that they did not secure their aims and ambitions and they did not secure anything from their war, and that they were humbled by the Palestinians. They were so upset with this sentiment that they decided to try to remind the Palestinians that they are still under occupation, that Israel still has the power. If Israel felt comfortable with its occupation and with its strength, it would not have committed the transgressions against Al-Aqsa Mosque today. It would not be considering whether it should go ahead with the Sheikh Jarrah evictions. I'm not saying these are things that demonstrate that Palestine is going to be free, but the fact that we're seeing these hesitations, the fact that we're seeing this Israeli rabid response to what has happened in the conflict, the fact we're seeing Palestinians celebrate that now the world is finally taking their narrative seriously, the fact that we're seeing these tangible developments that are taking place in the way that we talk about the issue, while it may well be true that it doesn't necessarily bring bread on the table or it doesn't liberate Palestine, what it means is that we're seeing progress. What it means is that this hopelessness that people had before.
Is the progress satisfactory? Do you think, Israel does it all the time. There seems to be a cycle. They bomb, destruction takes place, and of course these are American bombs. And then Europeans comes in and they rebuild a little bit, whatever they're able to do. And then Israel comes and bomb again. Do you expect this cycle to be broken this time? Or do you think this thing is something which Israel is going to do it again?
I think there are two dynamics that will severely influence Israel's ability to repeat this cycle again. The first is the internal Israeli debate. The first is this idea that the rockets penetrated the Iron Dome and that Israelis for the first time were suddenly woken up out of that bubble that they have been living in, whereby they used to see the war only insofar as it was on the border or on TV. This time the rockets actually landed on Tel Aviv. That has a big impact on the psychology in terms of how Israelis who have been quite comfortable in terms of their lifestyle and how things have developed, it changes their perspective in terms of how they see the conflict. And that's why I alluded earlier in that when Haaretz is publishing an article saying, yes, we have become an apartheid regime, when we're seeing an increasing number of Israeli analysts come out and say, we need to talk seriously about the prospect of giving Palestinians greater rights, we need to look seriously about the way that we treat the Palestinians, this is something that did not have traction before. The fact it's gaining traction suggests that there is a serious reflection that is beginning to take place in Israeli society. I'm not going to exaggerate and say that it will essentially transform the nature of the occupation, but what it means is that whereas beforehand Israel used to act with impunity, now we see a serious debate taking place amongst the Israelis that has the potential, that provides the opportunity to enact genuine change with regards to Israel's handling of the situation. The second dynamic is the American dynamic. We saw Israel lament that American Jews were increasingly vocal about their opposition to Netanyahu's actions in Gaza. Gaza and Netanyahu's actions in the Palestinians. And there was even an article in Hebrew that was published which said that we should give up on the American Jews and start communicating instead with evangelical Christians and providing greater attention to them as opposed to our own kinsmen insofar as the Jewish population is concerned. That is an acknowledgement on the part of the Israelis and the Israeli analysts that there is a shift in perceptions over Israel, a shift in perceptions over what Israel actually means, and a shift in perceptions over what Israel is supposed to represent for the Jewish psychology and for the Jewish conscience. And that is what has long-term consequences. Because when you have in the past that everybody was unified in the US over their approach to Israel, when we see now an unprecedented schism in whether America should continue to support Israel in that wider debate, it may well be a debate today, but the fact that it's come about after 70 years and the fact that it's actually been able to come about, this schism, this sudden questioning of US support for Israel, suggests that now there is an opportunity that this can develop, that if the Palestinians really take advantage of this schism that they have brought about as a result of their efforts, we could very well see a growing representation in Congress, not just AOC or Ilhan Omar or Rashida Tlaib or the like, a greater vocal movement in Congress whereby the US suddenly finds that it can no longer easily give Israel its impunity. And if US no longer gives Israel impunity with the ease that it has done beforehand, that naturally makes Tel Aviv think twice before repeating the cycle again. And I think the last point I will make on this particular issue is that note that Netanyahu was in a leaked phone call, a leaked recording, it is claimed that he told the Hungarian Prime Minister not to sign off on an EU condemnation of Israel, and that he criticized the growing anti-Israel European sentiment towards Netanyahu's actions, not Israel as it is. So this genuine shift in terms of attitudes and trends opens up opportunities that, quite frankly, did not exist even a year ago.
Well, thank you so much, Sami Hamdi, for your thoughts. Sami Hamdi is Editor-in-Chief of International Interest based in London, UK. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Back to you, Hena.
Thank you so much, Imam Mujahid and Sami Hamdi. That's all from our Washington studios tonight. Keep watching Muslim Network TV. For more, visit our website, muslimnetwork.tv. Assalamu alaikum and good night.